So last week we did week 2 of a book of beginnings, looking at Genesis on our kind of beginning our Old Testament survey. So we'll go through. There's a few review questions on the top of your page. So again, if you weren't here, hopefully this helps you sort of catch up with everybody else. And if you were here, then it helps you review, as the title says. Review question number 1 we were looking at, our title last week was Junior Architects. So we were looking at kind of Adam and Eve in the garden and why God put them there, what job he gave them to do. So question number 1, what does it mean for Adam to be in the image of God? Or at least one of the things that we talked about that it means for Adam to be in the image of God. Think and process things, yes. So specifically, last week we talked about God as a working God who creates, who builds, and then also God who's king of creation, who rules creation. And so in those two specific instances, in Adam's work and Adam's rule, he was imaging his creator. He was imaging God. And then question 2, what does subdue mean? And what was Adam to subdue, and what was the result to be? So first part, what does subdue mean?
Make it your slave.
Make it your slave, exactly. So that's literally what the word means. It's used multiple times throughout Scripture to enslave something or someone, to put it under subjection. Adam, what was he to subdue? What was he to make it his, slave, so to speak? Creation. Yeah, exactly. He was to subdue creation. And then what was the result of that subduing to be? So was it up to Adam to determine how creation should be subdued? To determine what was the best use of creation? What was the ultimate sort of purpose and result for his subduing? What's that, sir?
Creative work. Like he gave him something to do.
Yeah, well, yeah, that was the work, the job that God gave Adam to do, was to subdue creation. But creation, because it was Adam was to enslave it. Creation was made by God to serve man, but not just serve. Right? It wasn't just Adam can do whatever he wants with creation because it's his slave. There's still, even though it's to please man or to serve man, it's also to please God. So if it's serving man but not pleasing God, that's not a proper use or a proper way for Adam to subdue creation. Okay, so there are proper and improper ways for Adam to do his work. So question 3, describe the map of the original creation in Genesis 2. Somebody give just sort of a broad, we drew it up here on the board. Kind of generally what the world looked like, sort of the 3 areas of the world that are described in Genesis 2.
It was the garden.
Yeah, so there's the garden.
Eden was in the garden.
The garden was in Eden.
Yes.
So the garden was in the land of Eden. So you have the garden, bigger than the garden is the land of Eden, and then outside Eden we have everything else, the world, the outlying lands, right? Havilah, Cush, Assyria, all these lands that are described. So we are actually given some information about what the pre-flood world that Adam and Eve would have known, what it looked like. We don't have an actual map, but we generally know some of those basic things. And how do we know that the garden was a high place? What tells us that the garden was a high place? The rivers. Water goes downhill. So if the water is flowing out of the garden into the outlying lands, right? The river divides into 4 in the garden, and then it flows out into the world. So if it's flowing from the garden, it must be a high place. So what's the significance of this? What were some of the, kind of the imagery and how the Bible describes high places, what they're for?
Usually they built churches on high ground.
Right.
And also wanted to have a steeple height, so they would feel closer to God.
Right. So absolutely. So even kind of in the modern times, we've taken some of this high ground, high place imagery, and we even we build tall churches with tall steeples that are the biggest thing in town. And so in the Old Testament, right, we have God meeting man on high places, on mountains, right? You have the tabernacle is on a mountain, the temple is on a mountain. God meets Moses on a mountain. God, the Mount of Transfiguration. You have all these instances where God meets man on a mountain, in the high places. And so the garden was one of those places. It was a high place. It was a mountain. And so, question 5: in what ways is Adam's sin a failure of his priestly duties? Do you remember the two words that describe Adam's work? And they're also the same words that describe the priests and the Levites' work in the temple. Actually gave one of them away. One of them is work, and the other one is he was to work and keep the garden. He was to work and keep the garden. Those exact same words are used in combination nowhere else in Scripture except to describe Adam's work in the garden and the Levites' work in the temple. And so used to keep or to guard is what the word keep means. And so in what ways was Adam's sin a failure of his priestly duties then? If he was to work and keep or to guard the garden, how was that a failure of his priestly duties?
Well, one of his priestly duties that was his wife was to be in submission to him. He did not keep her from.
Absolutely.
He did not keep her from.
See, one of his jobs was to guard the garden and also to guard his wife, and he failed at both. He let a talking serpent convince his wife to eat forbidden fruit, right? So he failed in his duty to guard the garden. And then the last question: what is the difference between the falls of Adam, Cain, and the sons of God? Very end of last week, kind of looked at that chart. We saw how Adam's original fall was one fall of that sin resulted in that fall, but there are others in Genesis. And so we saw Cain fall when he killed his brother, and then we saw the sons of God fall with the daughters of men. And so what was the difference, I guess, in area between those three falls?
Adam's fall would have affected all humanity.
Yeah. So Adam's fall is unique in that it affected every person ever after that, right? He's the federal head of all humanity. The other ones are a little different in that sense. But so Adam's fall, where did it take place? In the garden. Okay, so what was Adam's punishment, or one of the punishments as a result of the fall? He couldn't stay in the garden. He was cast out of the garden. And then Cain, where did his sin take place?
Eden.
In Eden. And what was one of the results of his fall? He was banished from Eden. He was cast out of the land. And then the sons of God were in all the world, and they sinned in all the world, right? So we have those three areas. So the garden has experienced a fall, the land has experienced a fall. Now the entire world, through the sons of God and the daughters of men, have experienced a fall, and God casts them out of the world through the flood. So we have all three areas. The whole world has experienced sin and has experienced judgment. All right, so good review. So we're going to get on this week. We're going to conclude a book of beginnings. So conclude Genesis, and we're looking at from Babel to Bethel. From Babel to Bethel. So the flood, we just talked about the flood, is really, no pun intended, it's a watershed moment for human history. Okay, so it brings an end to one world, right? It completely destroys the old world, and it ushers in another world. And so the world, Peter kind of mentions in his epistles, that the world has really, through the flood, been baptized, right? And that's the imagery of baptism, is dying and coming back to life. And that's what the flood did to the world. So just as in the world that existed before the flood, right, sin quickly comes in to the new world as well. And fortunately for us, and we see in Scripture that where sin is great, right, God's love and mercy and grace is greater. So that's what we're going to see the result of this morning. God immediately steps in. So if you look at your notes there, we're going to begin with the story of Babel. And so, if you remember a few weeks ago, we looked at some like narrative structures of Old Testament writers and how they use different things. So can anybody tell me what this one looks like? What you call this type of narrative structure? So it's a chiasm. Okay, so remember a chiasm, as far as a narrative structure goes, it has three parts. There's a beginning and an end that are sort of equal and opposite. Okay, so you see in here we have in section A, the whole earth was one language, and then down at the bottom in A, the languages are confused over the whole earth. And you see how the whole time, B and B, C and C, they correspond. And then what you're really to notice as you see that is you need to find the middle portion that has no corresponding section, and that is a way for the writer to tell you what he wants you to notice, what he wants emphasized, what's important. So what we see in the story of Babel in the middle section is the Lord came down. The Lord came down. So sin comes, right? Ruins this new world, and God immediately steps in. So just as when sin ruined the world before the flood, when the new world is ruined, God steps in to put things back on track. So we need to remember too that Genesis is not written, or none of the Bible was written with chapter and verse. Okay, so sometimes we get confused because we assume, well, okay, chapter 11 has started, therefore it's a new thing, it's a new story. Well, that's put in by people later to make it convenient for us to help memorize the Bible, right? You can say chapter 11 verse 2 instead of somewhere near the beginning of Genesis. So when chapter 11 starts, it's carrying on from chapter 10. Okay, we have the Babel account in chapter 11, and it's not just a complete break from chapter 10. It's not separate from the accounting of the descendants of Shem. So that's what's in chapter 10, right? We have Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and so their descendants are being accounted for us. And the end of chapter 10 is Shem's descendants. So we're told at the end of chapter 10 that there's a certain clan of the Shemites, one of Shem's sons, Joktan. And actually it's from Joktan that Abram descends from. And so these Joktanites, they migrate to the east, we're told, right? And what is the imagery of migrating to the east, of going east? Away. You're going away from the garden, okay? Away from God, away from the land. So they migrate east. And this is where do we find Abram? One chapter later, in chapter 12. Where is he? He's not in the land anymore. He's in Ur. He's in Ur of the Chaldees, right? He's in the east, okay? Because he's one of these Joktanites. So chapter 11 opens by telling us that those who traveled east are the ones who set up Babel, or at least helped set up Babel. Because who do we know? Who's sort of the famous head of this whole project at Babel? Anybody know? Nimrod. Okay, so Nimrod, he was a descendant of Ham. He's the head of the project. But these Joktanites, who are sons of Shem, they're assisting Ham in this, or assisting Nimrod, who's a descendant of Ham, in this project. And so the descendants of Ham are an ungodly line. They're a cursed line. The descendants of Shem are the ones through whom, again, this seed of the woman that we talked about is eventually going to come. So this parallels exactly the story of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Right? You have the godly line of Seth, the sons of God, intermingling with the ungodly daughters of men, those in the line of Cain. And eventually that leads to judgment, to the flood. And now we see the exact same thing. We have the godly line of Shem, the Joktanites. They're marrying, so to speak, or partnering with the ungodly Hamites, those with Nimrod, in rebellion by building the tower. So, and then once again, just like it did with the flood, it's going to lead to judgment. So, when the sons of Seth, the line of the promised seed, fall into sin, God sends one of their own. That's Noah, to redeem the world. And then now when the faithful line of Shem falls into sin, God again sends one of their own, that's Abraham, whose seed will bring together the nations that were divided at Babel. So the builders of Babel want to build a tower that will connect heaven and earth. Right? We kind of talked about that in our opening questions. Right? A high place. It's at high places that God meets man. So they're trying to build this tower that will connect heaven and earth. In other words, it's a temple. Okay, it's a tower temple. And so though in the east, in the land away from God's presence, they're trying to reestablish the garden. Reestablish man's connection to God. So not only this, but there's a few things they're trying to do. Yes, they're trying to connect with God, but they're also trying to make a name for themselves. Right? The text tells us that. They're trying to make a name for themselves rather than exalting the name of God, of Yahweh. And then they also directly disobey God's command to fill the earth. Right? Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Because what do they say? They say, lest we be scattered abroad the face of the earth. So they're in direct opposition to those two things. They're trying to make a name for themselves instead of God, and to disobey God's command to fill the earth by gathering together, lest we be scattered abroad. So God, what does it tells us? That God comes down to see. He comes down to see what's going on. So seeing, right, it's not like God can't see them, like from heaven, okay? He doesn't have to come down to actually, peep with his eyes. Right? Seeing in Scripture often means making a judgment. Okay, so when the Lord draws near to see, he's inspecting the tower and deciding whether or not it will stand. So God sees their rebellion, and his response is kind of funny, actually. It's humorous. If you're paying attention to how it's written. Because verse 5 tells us that God has to, right, come down, like we said, in order to see what's going on. And so for these Babelites, their whole intention was to build this tower that would reach the heavens, and yet it's so far away from God that he has to, quote-unquote, come down to even be able to see it. Okay? So God's punishment, we talked about their two sort of major crimes, which are making a name for themselves and not filling the earth. The punishment that God gives them is fitting for these crimes, because so they don't want to be scattered. So what does God do? He scatters them even more widely than they probably ever would have been if they'd have just obeyed God's command to fill the earth. And then because they want to make a name for themselves, God gives them a name. But what's the name that he gives them? What does he call this tower? Okay, it's not the people that call it Babel. It's God that calls it Babel. And what does Babel mean? Anyone know? Confusion or folly. Okay, so God, you want to make a name for yourself? Here's your name. It's Babel. And so they were trying to be Babylon. They wanted to be Babylon. The word Babylon means gate of God. And that's what they expected this tower to be, a way for this, for God and man to kind of meet with this tower. But instead, God gives them the name, not Babylon, Babel. Folly, confusion. So that's your first section in your notes there, looking at Babel, the gate of God. And then we're going to see God's sort of answer to what happens at Babel. So the ruins of the Tower of Babel loom in the background of the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the genealogy of the Shemites starts in Genesis 10:21, at the end of chapter 10 of Genesis. It kind of takes a detour through Babel, right? We see these Joktonites and teaming up with Nimrod, and so there's a little detour there. But then the what's the word I'm looking for? The genealogy picks up again after Babel, and we see it end with Abraham. Okay, Abraham is part of the genealogy of Shem. And then the Babelites intend to make a great name for themselves, but Yahweh tells Abram that he will make his name great. Okay, not Babylon, not Babel. And then the Babelites intend to unite the whole world together, okay, by not scattering. But Yahweh tells Abram that he will make Abram unite the nations by making him a great nation through whom all the nations are blessed. Okay, so everything that the Babylonites intended, God refuses to give to them, and instead he gives it to Abram. So the Lord makes two basic promises to Abram. So both of them are telling us that through Abram's seed, God's going to build the true Babylon, right? The true gate of God, the true way for man to find their way back to God. So the first promise to Abraham is a seed. Abraham's promised a seed. So Abram's entire life, the entire story of Abram, revolves around this expectation of a son, right, of a child. Because Sarai is barren and she's getting old, right, the promise seems impossible, okay, or at the very least, incredibly, incredibly unlikely. So initially, who is Abram's heir? When we first meet Abram, who is his heir? Like if not initially. Lot. Okay, his nephew. Not Lot, his nephew, is his heir. And so when you read the story of Abram, you need to remember this because it helps explain some of Abram's actions. When he seems so protective of Lot, and he does a lot of things that if Lot was not his heir, he likely would not have been so concerned about. So initially, Lot is Abram's heir, and then Abram and Sarai make a decision together to have a son by Hagar, as a response, basically, to God for delaying his promise. So, not a great decision. But then eventually, Isaac is born, and the Lord tells Abram to go up to Mount Moriah, sacrifice Isaac. And Abraham obeys, and he believes God will raise Isaac from the dead, because God will fulfill his promise. This is my seed. So the whole story of Abraham revolves around this promise of a child, of a seed. So God promises with this promise of a seed to multiply Abram's house. So Adam and Noah, you remember, are commanded to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? Adam at the very beginning, Noah after the flood is given the same command to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. But then Abram is promised by God, I will make you fruitful. Okay, I will make you fruitful. So it goes from a command to a promise. So that's the first one, a seed. And then the second promise is a land is promised to Abram. So the land of Israel is going to be eventually, really, like a new Eden. Okay, we're told that it's going to be a land flowing with milk and honey, this promised land. And so within the land, Israel is going to build a new garden, okay, a temple, the house of God. Right, so we saw in the very beginning, the place where God meets with man is in the garden, on this mountain garden, in this high place. And so every time, right, that's why the temple is erected on Mount Moriah. The land is becoming, in a sense, a new garden, a place where man can meet God again. So it's no coincidence, really, that Abraham comes from Ur, right? He's in the east. We talked about last week, I guess, which direction, right? East is away from the garden, so you have to travel which direction in order to re-enter the land, symbolically. People travel west in order to re-enter the land, re-enter the garden. And that's what happens. So when Abram travels back to Canaan, he's traveling west on his way back to the garden. And then so those two promises, land and seed, circumcision is the sign of that covenant, and it really shows that the flesh itself is powerless to fulfill those promises. And so it shows Abram's need for God to be the giver of that seed. So Abram on his own could not, without a seed, you don't conquer a land. And if your wife is barren and too old to have a child, you can't do it on your own. You need God to do it. So now we go from, right, Babel was the gate of God, or Babylon. Babel was attempting to be the gate of God. And now we're going to look at Bethel, which is the gate of heaven. That's what the word Bethel means. So the seed promises, the land promises, they're also given to Isaac and Jacob. And then in Jacob's case, we see this connection to the land and the house of God become a lot clearer. So Jacob dreams. What is Jacob's famous dream? What does he dream about? A ladder. Jacob's ladder. So Jacob dreams of a ladder, and what is it doing? It's reaching up to heaven. What does that sound like? Babel. Okay? It's just like Babel, with its top reaching up to heaven. And so Jacob's ladder, really, you could say, is the true Babel. It's the true Tower of Babel. It's the true tower that connects heaven to earth. But instead of being built by men, it's built by Yahweh. So when Jacob wakes up from his dream, he calls the place the Gate of Heaven, which, as we just said, is reminiscent of the Babylonian Gate of God. And then by the end of the story, Jacob officially changes the name of the place from Luz to Bethel, which means house of God. And then at Bethel, the Lord reveals his answer to Babel. So he will build the way which connects earth to heaven. And he will build it in the land, and he will do it through Jacob's seed. Okay, so this is how these promises of land and seed are sort of connecting to this story here. So from Bethel, Jacob moves to Haran. So for roughly the next decade or so, a little more than that, Jacob's life is recorded in this way. So again, we have, what is this literary structure called? Anyone remember? A chiasm. Yeah, a chiasm. So we see the beginning and the end sort of equal and opposite in their telling, and then the middle is telling us something that's being emphasized. So what's being emphasized then by this middle section of the story? Jacob's getting a whole bunch of kids, and he's getting a whole bunch of livestock and wealth. Okay, so what's God doing to Jacob? He's blessing him, right? So the multiplication and the prosperity of Jacob's household is the central part of this story. The Lord is keeping his promise that he made with Jacob at Bethel, that he's going to build his house in the land through Jacob's seed. And so he gives Jacob a whole bunch of kids, and he gives him a whole bunch of wealth, animals, livestock. He's building Jacob a house. And then just our last section here, the beginning of the end. So the early chapters of Genesis showed us 3 falls, which we talked about in the review questions. So there's one fall in the garden, there's one in the land, and then there's one in the world, the outlying lands in the world. So Adam sins against God, Cain against his brother, the sons of God in their relationship to unbelievers in the world. But then the stories of the patriarchs focus on these same areas, but instead of falling, they act rightly. Okay, so Abraham, by willingly going to sacrifice his son, proves himself to be, unlike Adam, a faithful priest, right? At his sort of garden temple, his mountain. He went up to a mountain, to Mount Moriah, where the temple would later be constructed, and he acts like a faithful priest before God, unlike Adam. And then Jacob's life, right? We see, remember Cain's sin was conflict with his brother, he killed his brother, and then Jacob's life is taken up essentially with different familial conflicts, whether it's his father, his brother, his uncle. And then we see Joseph. Joseph goes into a foreign land amongst unbelievers and remains faithful. So he acts like the true son of God, but who rejects the daughters of men. So Joseph is a fitting ending to the book of beginnings. God opens the book by telling Adam to subdue and rule. Adam doesn't do a very good job, but then ends the book with Joseph literally ruling over the mightiest empire on the earth. So as great as Joseph is, though, his story is not the end of the story of Israel. Okay, the story of Israel hasn't even really started. So it's really the beginning. It's the end of this story in Genesis, but it's beginning another chapter, which we're going to look at next week, starting when we begin looking.